The resignation letter was already on Commander Adrian Vale's desk when he walked in that morning. I had placed it dead center beneath the brass nameplate he never bothered to straighten, where there was no chance his assistant, an aide, or some convenient emergency could bury it under another stack of reports. 3 sentences. A final date. My signature. Nothing dramatic enough to match the way my hands had shaken when I wrote it. Adrian stopped the moment he saw the envelope. I knew because, after 5 years of working beside him, I could recognize the difference between his normal silence and the kind that meant something had disrupted the order of his world. Mercer. He didn't look at me. What is this? I closed the folder in my hands. My resignation. His eyes lifted then. Adrian Vale had faced gunfire, carried wounded soldiers out of places most people only saw on the news, and returned home with enough medals that strangers stood straighter when he entered a room. None of that was visible in his expression now. Only disbelief. You're what? My resignation, sir. His gaze dropped back to the page, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable if he gave them another second. Effective in 4 weeks. Yes. Why? The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because I had spent so long imagining what it would feel like when he finally asked that I had expected anger, relief, maybe even satisfaction. Instead, all I felt was tired. Adrian had never been cruel in the obvious ways. That would have been easier. He never screamed at me, never humiliated me in front of anyone. He simply expected. The revised brief would be waiting when he arrived. His coffee would appear before he noticed he wanted it. The calls he didn't have patience for would already be handled. Names, schedules, anniversaries, meetings, the small preferences of people whose cooperation he needed. I remembered them so he didn't have to. If his day ran smoothly, that meant I had done my job well enough to become invisible. And somewhere along the way, I had helped him believe smooth was the natural state of things. Is this about the leave request? He asked. No, the promotion review? No, his jaw tightened. Then what exactly are you asking for? There it was. Asking for. Even now, he assumed the letter was the beginning of a negotiation. I set the folder on the edge of his desk. Nothing. For the first time, Adrian looked genuinely unsettled. Nothing. I'm not asking for a raise. I'm not asking you to move me to another department. I'm not asking for fewer hours. I kept my voice level because if I let 5 years into it, I wasn't sure I would stop. I'm leaving. His expression hardened into the one that had ended arguments in briefing rooms before they began. You should have spoken to me first. I almost answered automatically. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. I'll fix it, sir. The words had lived behind my teeth for years. This time, I let the silence sit there instead. I followed procedure, I said. Procedure. He repeated it like an accusation. You worked directly for me. For 4 more weeks. That changed the room. Not loudly. Adrian didn't raise his voice, and I didn't move. But something that had always existed between us shifted. He was still my commanding officer. He could assign my schedule, reject a draft, order a report rewritten before noon. What he could not do was turn those 4 weeks back into forever. His eyes stayed on me for several seconds. You're serious? I nodded. Yes. The disbelief left his face slowly, replaced by calculation. I had seen that look before. It was how Adrian approached impossible logistics. Identify the weakness, control the variables, find the solution. Take the afternoon, he said. Think about this when you're not exhausted. I already thought about it. Then take 2 days. Commander, a week. His voice sharpened. Whatever you need. That should have felt like victory. 5 years of canceling plans, staying late, arriving early, knowing what he needed before he asked. And suddenly he was offering me time as if he had just discovered I possessed it. Instead, something inside me went very still. That's kind of you, I said. But my decision isn't changing. Adrian stared at me. He had expected resistance he could overcome, frustration he could solve, a complaint he could answer. What I had handed him was worse. A choice that no longer belonged to him. I picked up the folder again. Your 9:30 briefing was moved to 10. Colonel Harris asked for the updated logistics summary before then. I sent you the revised version last night. Habit. Even while resigning, I was still clearing the road in front of him. I hated how natural it felt. Adrian's eyes flicked toward his computer, then back to me. Evan. He almost never used my first name during work. My hand tightened around the folder. Sir. Whatever he meant to say stopped there. For once, I didn't rescue him from the silence. I didn't offer the missing sentence, soften the moment, or make his discomfort easier to carry. I simply waited. Adrian looked down at the resignation letter again. The page seemed absurdly small on that wide desk. 3 sentences undoing 5 years of certainty. Then he asked, much quieter, "When did you decide I couldn't change your mind?" I looked at him and realized he still didn't understand. This wasn't about whether he could change my mind. It was about the fact that, until that letter reached his desk, he had never imagined he would need to. "My first handover notes will be ready by this afternoon," I said. I turned toward the door. Behind me, Adrian didn't call me back. Maybe because he finally understood that an order would not work. Maybe because he was still trying to decide which lever to pull. But as I stepped into the corridor, one certainty settled in me with a calm I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since I started working for Adrian Vale, my leaving was not a thought, a fantasy, or a threat I made only to myself. It was real. And now the man who had always assumed I would be there had 4 weeks to discover what that assumption had actually been costing both of us. By 10 o'clock that morning, the first thing went wrong. It was small enough that, a week earlier, Adrian probably would never have noticed it. Colonel Harris arrived for the rescheduled briefing with the wrong version of the logistics packet. I knew because I was standing at the side table when Harris opened the folder, frowned, and said, "This still has last month's deployment numbers." Adrian looked toward me automatically. I didn't move. For years, that look had been enough. I would already know which file he meant, where the corrected copy was, who had failed to replace the old version, and how to fix it without delaying the room more than 30 seconds. This time, I had done exactly what I told him I would do. The revised report was in his inbox. The handover notes listed where it was stored. The briefing room copies were no longer mine to prepare. Adrian held my gaze for a second, then looked back at Harris. "Give me a moment." He opened his laptop himself. The silence that followed was not dramatic. No one panicked. No one raised their voice. Adrian found the correct report in less than 2 minutes. But for 2 minutes, a room full of senior officers waited while the man famous for always being prepared searched through folders I used to organize before he arrived. I should have felt guilty. Instead, I felt something dangerously close to relief. The meeting continued. Adrian recovered quickly, as he always did. That was one of the things people admired about him. Nothing seemed to unsettle him for long. But when Harris asked about a scheduling conflict 3 days later, Adrian paused again. "Mercer." I checked my notes. "The conflict is listed in the transition file I sent this morning." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You normally resolve those before they reach me." I normally did. The word hung between us. Did, not do. Not well. Did. Harris glanced from Adrian to me, and then very carefully returned his attention to the report. Adrian handled the conflict himself. It took less than a minute. That was the point. None of these things were impossible without me. I had never believed they were. I wasn't some secret genius holding the entire command together with one hand. What I had done was quieter. I removed friction before Adrian felt it. I caught problems while they were still small enough to disappear. I remembered which officer needed numbers instead of summaries, which department would ignore an email unless someone called, which meetings Adrian could move, and which ones would cause 3 other schedules to collapse if touched. I had spent 5 years making sure he rarely had to stop and ask why something wasn't working. Now I was letting the system show him the answer. Not out of spite. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was completing my assigned duties, documenting my responsibilities, and refusing to keep performing the invisible layer that had never officially belonged to me. By lunch, Adrian had called my name 4 times. Each time for something he could solve himself. Each time, I answered only what was actually mine to answer. Around 1, I stepped outside with a sandwich and sat on the low concrete wall behind the administration building. I had eaten lunch at my desk so often that the courtyard felt unfamiliar. There were trees back there. I had known that, technically. I had just never had reason to look at them. My phone stayed silent for 6 whole minutes. Then it vibrated. Adrian. I stared at his name until the screen went dark. He had my schedule. He knew I was at lunch. Nothing in the building was burning down. For once, I let the call become a missed call. The strange thing was that I expected panic. Instead, I took another bite of my sandwich. When I returned, Adrian was standing outside my office. He had never waited for me there before. People waited for him. "You didn't answer." "I was at lunch." I know. He sounded irritated, then seemed to hear his own words. His expression changed slightly. I needed the contact for General Foster's aide. I unlocked my office door. It's in the shared directory. It wasn't under Foster. It's under the aide's name. Which is... I looked at him. Adrian stared back. A week earlier, I would have given him the name immediately. I might have already called the aide before Adrian finished asking. Now I pointed toward his tablet. The transition notes include a contact index. His jaw tightened. You made an index. For whoever replaces me. That stopped him. Just for a second. But I saw it. The word replaces had landed differently from resignation. Resignation was paperwork. Replaces meant another person at my desk. Another. Voice answering his calls. Another set of hands passing him a morning brief. Adrian looked past me into my office. His eyes moved over the folders stacked in labeled rows, the calendar on the wall, the small printer that had jammed every winter for 3 years. Ordinary things. Things he had passed 1,000 times without seeing. How long have you been building these handover files? He asked. Since I decided to leave. That isn't what I asked. I knew what he meant. How long had I been planning this without him noticing? 3 weeks. His face went still. 3 weeks. Yes. And nothing changed. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because that was the clearest answer I could have given him. Exactly. He stared at me. The irritation disappeared. Something quieter replaced it. He had finally noticed the shape of the problem. For 3 weeks, I had been preparing to remove myself from his life, and because I had continued making everything easy for him, he had seen nothing. Adrian looked down at the tablet in his hand. I didn't know you were doing half of this. I could have told him that was the problem. Instead, I opened my office door. The index is on page 4. He didn't move. Evan. This time my name sounded less like a command and more like a question he had not figured out how to ask. I waited. He looked toward his office, then back at me. What else am I going to find out I don't know? I had no answer for him. Not because I was hiding anything. Because, until that moment, I wasn't sure I knew either. I had spent so many years measuring my usefulness by how little Adrian had to notice that I had never stopped to count everything I had made invisible. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to see the empty spaces I would leave behind. And if one missed packet, one unanswered lunch call, and one contact index had already changed the way he looked at me, I could only wonder how much of his carefully controlled life had been resting on things he had never known I was carrying. Adrian asked me to stay after the last briefing the next afternoon. Not because a report was missing. Not because he needed a phone number. This time, when the room emptied, he closed the door and said, "Sit down." I remained standing. His eyes flicked toward the chair, then back to me. That wasn't an order. Good. Something tightened in his face. A week earlier, I would never have answered him that way. Apparently, once you put an expiration date on obedience, certain habits became easier to see. Adrian moved behind his desk. My resignation letter was still there, no longer centered beneath his nameplate, but placed beside his keyboard. He had not filed it away. I reviewed your transition notes. Okay. 43 pages. There's an index. I noticed. I almost smiled. He didn't. You documented tasks that aren't in your position description. Some of them aren't. Most of them aren't. Then whoever replaces me won't be responsible for them. He leaned back slightly. That's not practical. It's accurate. Evan. Sir. Stop doing that. Doing what? Answering every question like we're discussing paperwork. I looked at the letter beside his hand. We are discussing paperwork. His jaw shifted. There it was again. The instinct to regain control of a conversation simply by refusing its terms. I spoke with personnel, he said. There are options. I waited. Your workload can be formally reduced. We can restructure the position. If compensation is part of this, I can request an adjustment. If you want reassignment, I'll approve it. He listed each solution with the calm precision he used in operational meetings. For a moment, I understood why people trusted him in impossible situations. Give Adrian Vale a problem with variables, and he would rearrange the variables until the problem surrendered. But he was still solving the wrong problem. No, he stopped. No to which part? All of it. His voice went quieter. You haven't even heard the specifics. Because the specifics don't matter. They matter if they address the reason you're leaving. They don't. That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. Then tell me what does. I could have given him a list. The late nights. The calls during leave. The way he handed me problems without asking whether I had room to carry them. The years of being praised for reliability whenever what he really meant was availability. But a list would have turned this into another briefing. Adrian would have taken notes, corrected each item, and believed the relationship had been repaired because the symptoms were gone. "You're still assuming I want you to make this job easier for me," I said. "Don't you?" "No, I don't want this job anymore." Silence. His gaze hardened. "People don't walk away from 5 years because of nothing." I didn't say it was nothing. "Then what are you saying?" "That I'm not negotiating." He stood. Not abruptly, but the movement changed the room. Adrian was taller than me, broader, and accustomed to people responding when he occupied space. I had responded too. For years. Before he asked. Sometimes before he even knew what he wanted. "I can delay the transfer process," he said. There it was. Not a threat. Not cruelty. Just authority reaching automatically for the nearest lever. "You can." He seemed surprised by the agreement. "You can delay the paperwork. You can keep me assigned here until the process is complete. You can decide what I work on until my final day." I held his gaze. "But you can't make me choose this again." Adrian went completely still. That was the moment something changed. I saw it before he spoke. Until then, he had treated my resignation as a problem with an outcome he could influence. Better conditions. More money. Time off. A different assignment. Administrative delay. Every option assumed the same ending. I stayed because he found the correct reason for me to stay. Now there was a possibility he had not accounted for. There might not be an offer large enough because I was no longer asking him to improve the arrangement. I was ending it. "You've already decided," he said. "Yes." "Before you put that letter on my desk." "Yes." "And there is nothing I can offer you?" The question was different this time. Less commander. More man standing in a room where one of his assumptions had stopped obeying him. I looked at the handover file between us. "Not if the offer is just another way to keep everything the same." His eyes dropped to it. "You think that's what I'm doing?" "I think. You're trying to stop me from leaving before you understand why I stopped wanting to stay." He didn't answer. I could hear the ventilation system above us, the faint movement of people in the corridor, a phone ringing somewhere beyond the door. Ordinary sounds. Nothing dramatic had happened. Adrian still had his rank. I still had 3 weeks and several days left on my notice. Yet the balance between us no longer felt ordinary. He walked back to the desk and picked up my resignation letter. "You said whoever replaces you won't be responsible for everything in these notes." "Correct. So who will be?" "Some tasks belong to other offices. Some can be distributed. Some probably never needed to be done. And the rest?" I hesitated. "You'll have to decide." He looked at me. "Me? They're your priorities." For once, I didn't soften the answer. Adrian set the letter down slowly. "I thought you were asking me to fix something." "I know. You're not." No, his eyes stayed on the page. Then he said, almost to himself, "So I've been trying to solve the wrong problem." I didn't rescue him from that realization either. I picked up my copy of the transition schedule and headed for the door. "Mercer." I stopped. "If I can't change your mind, what exactly am I supposed to do with the next 3 weeks?" I turned back. The answer that came to me surprised me because it wasn't bitter. "Pay attention." His expression shifted. "To what?" "To what changes when I stop making everything easy." I left before he could turn that into another negotiation. For the first time since my resignation hit his desk, Adrian was no longer asking how to keep me. He was beginning to ask what he had failed to see. And that question was going to be harder for him to solve because the answer wasn't hidden in my resignation letter. It was already all around him, in every problem I had quietly prevented, every decision I had carried before it reached him, and every part of his life that had felt effortless only because I had been there. The next week made Adrian's question impossible to avoid. He had told me to pay attention, so I did. More importantly, I stopped preventing him from having to. Not carelessly, not vindicatively. I completed every task that still belonged to me, sent every handover document when I said I would, and answered every question that actually required my answer. I simply stopped doing the work that had never appeared on any chart because I had made it disappear before anyone needed to name it. By Tuesday morning, Adrian's calendar had become the first casualty. Nothing catastrophic happened. That was almost worse. A meeting ran 20 minutes over because no one had warned him the next appointment involved someone who considered lateness a personal insult. A request he would normally have received with 3 lines of context arrived raw, forcing him to spend 10 minutes figuring out why it mattered. 2 departments scheduled reviews on the same afternoon because I had stopped quietly coordinating their assumptions for them. Adrian handled every problem. Of course he did. He was competent, disciplined, and annoyingly difficult to overwhelm. But now he had to see each problem before he could solve it. That was new. On Wednesday, I walked into his office with the latest handover schedule and found him staring at 3 different versions of the same briefing memo. "Which one is current?" he asked. "The one marked final." His eyes moved across the file names. 2 are marked final. 1 says final revised. That is not a system. It's the system the policy office uses. He looked at me. How did I never see this? You never had to. The answer landed harder than I intended. Adrian sat back. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he opened my transition notes again. I had watched him do that more and more lately. At first he treated them like a replacement manual. Now he read them like evidence. "You called them every Thursday," he said. "Policy." "Yes." "Why?" "Because if I waited for them to send the update, you usually got it after your Friday review." "Did I ask you to do that?" "No, did anyone?" "No," he frowned. "Then why did you?" The obvious answer rose first. Because it needed to be done. I almost said it. I had said versions of that sentence for years. Instead, I thought about his question. "Because you hated walking into meetings without the latest numbers." Adrian's expression changed slightly. "So you built your week around that?" "Part of it." Without telling me. I gave him a tired look. "Would you have wanted a weekly report on all the things I did to avoid bothering you?" He didn't answer. That afternoon, he canceled one of the standing requests he had routinely sent through my office. Not because I asked. I only noticed because the message appeared in the shared system with his name attached instead of mine. For the first time, he had looked at a process I used to absorb and decided it did not need to exist. It should have felt satisfying. Instead, it unsettled me. Adrian was changing behavior before I had decided what that meant. I had expected him to notice the workload. I had not expected him to question why it had become mine. By Thursday, the handover meeting with personnel made the problem even clearer. The replacement role had been drafted from my official duties, not from the 43 pages of transition notes Adrian kept rereading. "We can assign the administrative coordination," the personnel officer said. "But several of these functions belong to separate offices. They shouldn't be consolidated under one position." Adrian looked at me. I kept my face neutral. "And the rest?" he asked. "Some appear discretionary." Meaning no one formally required them. Adrian's hand went still on the table. I knew exactly which line he was reading. The weekly calls, the pre-brief summaries, the scheduled buffering, the quiet follow-ups after meetings when Adrian had said, "Make sure that gets handled," and never had to think about what happened next. No one had required me to do most of it. I had simply learned what made his days easier, then made those things part of mine. "We'll distribute what's necessary," the officer continued. "Anything else can be discontinued." Adrian closed the document. "Understood." He barely spoke for the rest of the meeting. Later, I found him alone in the conference room, still sitting where everyone else had left him. "You have another meeting in 15 minutes, I said from the doorway. He looked up. "I know. That stopped me. Usually I would have reminded him because I assumed he didn't. This time he already had the schedule open in front of him. "Okay." I started to leave. "Evan." I turned. He tapped the transition document once. "They can replace the position." "Yes." "They can redistribute the tasks." "Yes." "So why does it still feel like something is missing?" I didn't know how to answer that without stepping somewhere neither of us had agreed to go. "Maybe because you're used to how I work." That's what I thought. His voice was quiet. "I'm not sure that's all of it anymore." I held his gaze. For days, every consequence had pointed to one simple conclusion. I had done more than he realized. That should have been enough. It was measurable, practical, easy to understand. But Adrian no longer looked like a commander studying an inefficient system. He looked like someone who had solved the obvious problem and discovered the answer did not explain what was bothering him. I left him there with 12 minutes until his meeting and no reminder from me. For the first time, I wondered if the real thing my resignation had taken from Adrian wasn't efficiency at all. And if it wasn't, then the next question between us was going to be much harder than deciding who would take over my desk. The next morning, Adrian stopped asking me what would happen when I left. He started asking what had already happened while I was still there. I noticed the difference because his first question had nothing to do with my transition notes. When did I start taking coffee in this office instead of the briefing room? I looked up from the schedule on my tablet. What? Adrian stood by the window with an untouched cup in his hand. I used to drink it downstairs before the morning briefing. Years ago. Why did that change? I thought about it. You started taking early calls from here after your promotion. And the coffee? I brought it up. Every morning. Usually. He looked at the cup as if it had become evidence. I never asked you to. No, you just noticed. I gave him a cautious look. Are we really discussing coffee? I'm not sure. That answer stayed with me. For days, Adrian had been cataloging the things I did. Scheduling. Follow-ups. Briefing preparation. The calls I made before problems reached him. Those things fit neatly into the explanation we had both settled on. I had become more useful than either of us realized. Useful was measurable. Useful could be redistributed. Useful could be replaced badly, then eventually replaced well. But something about the coffee bothered him because there was no operational reason for it. Neither was there an operational reason I knew he stopped eating when a briefing went badly, or that he preferred written summaries after crowded events because too many voices left him drained, or that he sometimes stood by the window for exactly 5 quiet minutes before difficult meetings. None of those details were in my job description. Most were not in my handover notes either. Your replacement doesn't need to know how you take your coffee, I said. Adrian's eyes lifted to mine. That isn't what I asked. Then what are you asking? He set the cup down. I don't know yet. For Adrian Vale, that was almost an admission of defeat. He was a man who preferred incomplete answers to unanswered questions. But this time he didn't push. He simply picked up his briefing folder and left. The contradiction followed us through the next 2 days. The official handover became easier. Personnel redistributed responsibilities. Other offices reclaimed tasks that should have belonged to them all along. Adrian learned where files lived, who needed to be called, what information arrived late unless someone chased it. The practical problem was becoming solvable. And somehow, that made him more unsettled. On Friday afternoon, I brought him the final version of the replacement role. This covers everything personnel approved, I said. Adrian scanned it. It's reasonable. It is. The new structure should work. Yes. He looked at me. Then why doesn't that make this better? My fingers tightened around the edge of the folder. That was the question part of me had been avoiding because I had begun noticing the same thing from the opposite direction. I had expected Adrian's attention to satisfy something in me. For years, I had wanted him to notice. Now he did. He asked before assuming. He checked his own schedule. He stopped sending routine requests through me simply because he could. Once, when I was already leaving for lunch, he started to call my name, glanced at the clock, and stopped himself. Tiny things. Changes I would once have treated like proof that staying had finally become worth it. But I no longer trusted myself to read them that way. Adrian closed the document. If the job can be replaced, he said slowly, why does it feel like you can't? The room went very quiet. I could have protected both of us by making the answer practical. Experience. Familiarity. 5 years of institutional knowledge. Instead, I said, maybe you're used to me. Adrian gave a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. That's what you said yesterday. It's still true. It's not enough. I looked at him. He continued before I could answer. I know what happens when you're not handling the schedule now. I know what calls you used to make. I know which problems you prevented. We've identified those things. His hand rested on the replacement document. They're fixable. Eventually. Exactly. He pushed the paper a few inches away. So why am I still counting how many days you have left? My heartbeat stumbled. Adrian seemed almost irritated by his own question. Not at me. At the fact that he couldn't reduce it to something he knew how to solve. You're losing someone you've worked with for 5 years, I said. Anyone would notice that. Would they know you hate the cafeteria coffee, but drink it anyway when you're too busy to leave the building? I stared at him. He kept going, more quietly now. Would they know you rewrite difficult emails 3 times when you're angry because you don't trust yourself to send the first version? Would they know you tap your thumb against your index finger when you're trying not to argue with me? My hand went still at my side. I hadn't known he noticed that. Adrian looked almost as surprised as I felt. That was the moment the shape of the problem changed. He had missed enormous things about what I carried for him, yes. But he had not been blind to me in the way I had believed. He had noticed details that had no professional value at all. He just never understood what noticing them meant. And I had spent so long measuring his care by whether he relieved my burden that I had assumed the absence of that action meant the absence of attention entirely. Neither conclusion excused the other. Adrian had still taken my presence for granted. I had still made myself endlessly available until resentment became easier than honesty. But the relationship between us was suddenly harder to name. I don't know what you want me to say, I admitted. Neither do I. He looked down at the resignation letter still beside his keyboard. That's becoming a problem. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, hope arrived, small and unwelcome, because hope was dangerous when I had only just learned how to leave. Adrian's voice dropped. I thought I was losing the person who made my work easier. He paused. I don't think that's what this is anymore. I couldn't answer. Not because I disagreed. Because, for the first time, I didn't know whether Adrian wanted me back because he finally saw me, or because losing access to me had made him realize how deeply he had built his life around my presence. And those were not the same thing. After that conversation, Adrian stopped trying to convince me to stay. Somehow, that was harder. I had prepared myself for pressure. Better terms. More authority. Another carefully constructed solution designed to make leaving seem unnecessary. Instead, Monday morning arrived, and when I stepped into his office with the briefing folder, Adrian looked at the clock before he looked at me. You're not supposed to be in for another 20 minutes. I glanced at the time. I wanted to finish the handover notes. They can wait 20 minutes. I almost told him they couldn't. The answer was already forming when I realized how ridiculous it was. Of course they could. Adrian held out his hand for the folder. Go get breakfast. I already ate. Then sit somewhere that isn't this office. There was no command in his voice. No irritation either. Just an awkward attempt at something I didn't quite trust yet. You don't have to prove anything, I said. His hand lowered. Is that what you think I'm doing? I don't know what you're doing. Neither do I, he admitted. But I know what I was doing before. That stopped me. Adrian looked down at the folder between us. I kept asking what I could change so you would stay. I never asked whether staying was good for you. Hope tried to move inside me again. I shut it down before it got far, realizing that doesn't fix it. I know. No argument. No counteroffer. Just two words that left me with nothing to push against. I handed him the folder and walked out. For the rest of the morning, Adrian did something I had never seen him do consistently. He carried the inconvenience himself. When a scheduling problem surfaced, he didn't call me automatically. When an office sent incomplete information, he sent it back instead of handing it to me to untangle. At 11, I saw him standing beside the shared printer reading the instructions for clearing a paper jam. I nearly laughed. Don't, he said without looking up. I didn't say anything. You were going to. I was going to ask if the machine had finally met an opponent it respected. He looked at me then, and for half a second the corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest we had come to normal since my resignation. That frightened me more than the arguments had. Normal was exactly what I could not afford to mistake for change. By afternoon, that fear had sharpened into a question I could no longer avoid. Adrian cared. Part of me finally believed that. But caring was not the same as changing. And noticing me now, when I was already halfway out the door, did not prove he would have noticed me if I stayed. Near the end of the day, he appeared beside my desk. Do you have 10 minutes? For what? He paused. I'm trying not to say I need you in my office. Progress. Painful progress. I followed him anyway. He didn't sit behind his desk. Instead, he took one of the chairs beside the small conference table, leaving the other for me. It was such a minor choice that I almost resented noticing it. Personnel needs your final confirmation by Friday, he said. I know. After that, your departure date is locked. It already is for me. Adrian absorbed that without flinching. I understand. He folded his hands. I owe you an apology. My chest tightened. Adrian, let me finish. I did. I treated your reliability like permission, he said. If you handled something once, I assumed you would handle it again. If you answered after hours, I assumed you were available. If you anticipated what I needed, I let myself believe that meant I didn't have to ask what it cost you. His voice remained steady, but there was nothing rehearsed about it. And because you were good at carrying it, I never questioned why you were carrying so much. It was the apology I had once imagined wanting. Clear. Specific. No excuses. And it still wasn't enough. That realization hurt in a way anger never had. Thank you, I said. Adrian watched me. But if you're saying this because you think it changes Friday, It doesn't. His expression tightened, though not with anger. I said I understand. Do you? I'm trying to. I stood and walked toward the window, needing space from the table, from him, from the dangerous part of me that wanted one sincere apology to erase 5 years of making myself smaller. You notice me now, I said. You're changing things now. You're asking questions now. But I don't know if that's because you finally understand me or because you're about to lose me. Adrian was silent. I turned back. And I can't stay just to find out. The words landed between us. His face changed, not because I had surprised him, but because I had finally named the test he could not solve with a promise. What would prove it, he asked. I don't know. There has to be something. That's the problem. I shook my head. If I give you a list, you'll do the list. You'll hit every point. You'll turn it into another mission. Adrian looked away because he knew I was right. So I'm supposed to do nothing? No. You're supposed to decide who you are when doing the right thing doesn't guarantee you get what you want. His eyes came back to mine. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Adrian nodded once. All right. I almost asked what that meant. I didn't. Friday came too. Days later. The final personnel confirmation sat open on my screen, waiting for one click. Adrian knew the deadline. So did I? He never mentioned it. At 4:17, I confirmed my resignation. A notification appeared almost immediately. Departure approved. Final date unchanged. My stomach dropped even though it was exactly what I wanted. I sat there staring at the screen until I heard Adrian's office door open. He stopped beside my desk. His eyes moved to the confirmation on my monitor. For 1 second, I saw the loss hit him. Then he looked at me. Is that what you chose? Yes. His jaw tightened. Then I won't interfere with it. He walked back to his office without asking me to reconsider. I watched him go, and for the first time since I handed him that letter, the question wasn't whether Adrian cared. I knew he did. The question was whether his care could survive the one thing he had never been good at giving me, the freedom to make a choice that took me away from him. The final week began with Adrian keeping his promise. That should have made leaving easier. Instead, it stripped away every excuse I still had for not deciding what his change meant to me. He stopped calling after hours. He stopped sliding work across my desk simply because I was the fastest person in the room. When problems surfaced, he handled the part that belonged to him before asking anyone else to carry the rest. None of it was dramatic. That was what made it difficult to dismiss. On Tuesday morning, I found a revised responsibility chart attached to the transition packet. Several tasks I had quietly absorbed over the years were no longer assigned to my replacement. They had been returned to the offices that actually owned them. Others had Adrian's name beside them. I stared at the page long enough that he noticed. Something wrong. You put the review follow-ups under your office. They are my follow-ups. You hate them. I know. You'll forget half of them. Probably. I looked at him. Then why? Adrian closed the report he was reading. Because giving them to the next person just because you carried them would be repeating the same mistake. There was no plea attached. No. Look, asking me to reward him. He simply went back to work. That was the problem. I had told him not to turn change into a mission designed to win me back, and somehow he had understood. He was doing the work without demanding that I watch. By Wednesday, my desk had started to look temporary. Personal notes disappeared into a box. The old mug I kept in the bottom drawer went home. My handover documents were complete. Every visible sign of 5 years in that office was shrinking into something another person could occupy. Adrian never asked me to stop packing, but he noticed. I could tell because his eyes went to the empty corner where my coat used to hang every morning. 3 days, he said. Yes. He stood there for a moment. I thought respecting your decision would make this simpler. For who? A tired smile touched his face. Fair question. I waited for him to say more. He didn't. That restraint hurt more than pressure would have. Pressure would have given me something to resist. Restraint left me alone with the possibility that he really was changing. And if he was, I had to face a truth I had been avoiding since the day he admitted the problem was no longer about work. Part of me still wanted him. Not the commander who assumed I would stay late because I always had. Not the man who turned reliability into permission. The version standing in front of me now, learning to ask instead of expect, was harder to leave. Which made leaving more important, not less. I needed to know I could still choose it. On Thursday afternoon, personnel sent the final separation packet. One signature remained. Adrian's acknowledgement that my handover was complete and that I would be released from assignment at 5 the next day. I knew the form would reach him. I also knew exactly what he could do with it. He could request an extension. Nothing permanent. Nothing cruel. Just a procedural delay justified by operational continuity. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Long enough to keep me near him. Long enough for every new habit between us to start feeling normal. Long enough for me to wonder if resigning had been necessary after all. Adrian walked into my office holding the form. My pulse immediately quickened. "Personnel says I can request an extension," he said. At least he was honest. "I know. Your replacement doesn't start until the following Monday." "I know that too. There'll be a gap. 3 days. 4, technically." I almost smiled. "You checked?" "Of course I checked." He looked down at the paper. For several seconds, neither of us moved. This was the first time since Friday that the choice in front of him had a real price attached. If he signed, he lost me on schedule. If he delayed, he could tell himself it was practical. No threat. No abuse of power dramatic enough for anyone else to question. Just one small use of authority that would give him more time. Adrian lifted his eyes. "If I ask you to stay through next week, would you?" The old answer lived inside me. Yes. I hated that it was still there. Not because I wanted to obey him, but because I wanted more time too. More mornings where he noticed the clock before asking for something. More conversations where he listened instead of solving. More chances to discover whether this version of us could have existed before I resigned. "If you ask," I said carefully, "I don't know." Adrian's face tightened. "That isn't a no." "No," he looked at the form again. "And if I don't ask?" The question exposed everything. If he didn't ask, he risked losing me. If he did, he risked using the exact imbalance he claimed to understand. I watched him wrestle with it in silence. Then Adrian walked to my desk, placed the paper between us, and signed. No extension. No condition. No attempt to turn my hesitation into permission. He slid the form toward me. "Tomorrow at 5, he said. My throat tightened. "Adrian, you told me to decide who I am when doing the right thing doesn't guarantee I get what I want." His voice was steady, but his hand remained flat against the desk for a second longer than necessary. "I heard you." I looked at his signature. That one stroke did more than every apology he had given me. He had the power to create more time, and for the first time, he chose not to use it. "You might lose me," I said. "I know. Completely." His jaw tightened. "I know. And you're still signing it." Adrian met my eyes. "If the only way I can keep you is by making your choice harder to exercise, then I haven't changed anything." The room went quiet. Something inside me gave way. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the part of me that had been waiting for proof he could value me without treating access to me as his reward. I picked up the signed form. "Thank you." Adrian nodded once. "You don't owe me anything for that." I almost laughed because 6 weeks ago he would never have understood why those words mattered. Now they landed somewhere deep. The next morning, my last day, I finished the handover before noon. By 4:30, my desk was empty except for my badge, a pen, and the small box beside my chair. Adrian stayed in his office. He did not manufacture one final task. He did not find an excuse to keep me after 5. At 4:58, I stood with my coat over one arm and looked toward his door. It was open. Adrian sat behind his desk, the same desk where my resignation letter had changed everything. He looked up. Neither of us spoke. 2 minutes remained, and suddenly every consequence of the last month seemed to meet in that silence. He had proven he could let me leave. Now I had to face the question his choice had placed entirely in my hands. At 5 o'clock, I was free to walk away from Commander Adrian Vale without permission, guilt, or unfinished obligation. The only thing I still didn't know was whether walking away was what I actually wanted. At 5 o'clock, I picked up my box and walked toward Adrian's open door. He rose when he saw me. Not as my commander calling a subordinate in. Not as a man trying to stop someone from leaving. He simply stood there while I crossed the room. My resignation letter was still on the corner of his desk. The same 3 sentences. The same signature. The paper that had once felt like the only way I could make myself visible. "It's 5, I said. Adrian glanced at the clock. "I know." My badge felt heavier in my hand than it should have. I placed it on his desk beside the letter. That was it. 5 years reduced to a badge, a cardboard box, and a decision neither of us could undo. Adrian looked at the badge but didn't touch it. "Your handover is complete," he said. "Yes." "Personnel has everything." "Yes." He gave one slow nod. Then you're free to go. I had spent weeks waiting to hear those words. When they came, they hurt. Not because I wanted him to take them back. Because he meant them. There was no hidden request beneath them. No expectation that I would recognize his pain and save him from it. Adrian had finally done the one thing I wasn't sure he could do. He had let the choice remain mine. I tightened my grip on the box. You could ask me to stay. The words escaped before I could decide whether I should say them. Adrian's eyes met mine. I could, but you won't. His face was calm, but not untouched. You told me what was wrong. If I turn your freedom into another test of how much you care about me, then I'm doing the same thing again. That answer should have made walking away simple. Instead, it removed the last thing I could blame. For years, I had told myself I stayed because Adrian needed me. Then I convinced myself I had to leave because he only valued what I did. Now I stood in front of a man who had finally shown me that he could want me and still refused to use that want as leverage. And suddenly the decision was no longer about what Adrian deserved. It was about what I wanted. That frightened me. I don't know what happens if I walk out that door, I admitted. Adrian swallowed. Neither do I. You might never see me again. I know. You keep saying that. Because I need you to believe I understand it. There was no heroic certainty in his voice. No commander who already knew the outcome. He looked like a man accepting that doing the right thing might cost him something he could not replace. My eyes dropped to the resignation letter. When I wrote that, I thought leaving was the only way I could stop being useful long enough to find out if I mattered. Adrian's expression tightened. Evan, let me finish. He went quiet. And then everything after it became about you noticing. The work. The things I handled. The things you didn't ask for. Then you started noticing me. I paused. For a while, I thought that was what I wanted. It isn't. It is. But not the way I thought. I put the box down on the chair beside me. If I stay because you finally see me, then I'm still letting your attention decide what I'm worth. Adrian did not argue. That was another change. So what do you want? He asked. The question was simple. It was also the hardest one he had ever given me, because there was no correct answer hidden inside it. No task to complete. No version of myself that would make his life easier. I looked toward the hallway behind me. I could leave. My employment was over. My obligations were finished. Adrian had signed the form that made sure of it. If I walked out, no one could accuse me of failing him. If I stayed in this room another minute, it would be because I chose to. The realization loosened something in my chest. I still want to leave this job, I said. Adrian's eyes flickered, but he nodded. All right. I mean it. I know. I'm not taking the resignation back. I'm not asking you to. I took a breath. But I don't think I want leaving the job to mean losing you. Adrian went completely still. For once, I let him carry the silence. I didn't explain the sentence for him. I didn't soften it. I waited until he understood it on his own. You're saying, he stopped himself and tried again. What are you asking for? A small laugh escaped me. That question still needs work. His mouth almost curved. Apparently. I'm not asking for a new arrangement inside this office. I'm not asking you to find a different title for me. And I'm not promising anything. Okay. If there's something between us outside of all this, I looked at the desk, the badge, the letter, all the evidence of the structure we had just dismantled. Then it has to start after I'm no longer working for you. It has to be something I can say no to without consequences. Something neither of us gets to assume. Adrian looked at me for a long moment. And if you decide you don't want it? My chest ached at how quietly he asked. Then you accept that? He nodded. Yes. Even after everything that happened? Especially after everything that happened. There it was. The answer I had needed without knowing how to ask for it. Not promise. Not possession. Permission was the wrong word too, because I didn't need his permission anymore. What he was giving me was space for my choice to remain real. Then ask me something, I said. Adrian frowned slightly. What? Something that isn't in order. Something you don't already know I'll say yes to. Understanding came slowly. He glanced at the clock again. 5:03. I was no longer his employee. Then he looked back at me. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow? My heart beat once hard. It would have been easy to answer immediately. The old Evan would have. The old Evan believed hesitation was inconvenience and availability was kindness. I let myself think. Adrian waited. No pressure. No correction. No assumption. Finally, I said, yes. Relief crossed his face, but he didn't reach for me. He didn't turn my answer into something larger than it was. 7. 7 works. I picked up my box again. Adrian looked at it. Do you want help? Another question, not an assumption. I smiled despite myself. No, I've got it. All right. I turned toward the door, then stopped beside his desk. My resignation letter sat exactly where this had begun. I touched one corner of the page. Keep that. Adrian looked surprised. Why? Because it worked. You resigned from a job you were good at, forced me to confront 5 years of bad habits, and nearly walked out of my life. Exactly. His laugh was quiet and exhausted. Mine was real. Then I walked out carrying my own box. This time Adrian did not follow. He did not call my name. He let me leave. And for the first time, walking away did not feel like rejection, punishment, or proof that I had failed to make myself necessary. It felt like what it had always needed to be, a choice. Tomorrow, if I came back to Adrian Vale, I would not be coming back because he needed me. I would come back because I wanted to. And whatever happened next would have to begin there. The next evening, I arrived at the restaurant at 7:03. Adrian was already there. Of course he was. He stood when he saw me, then stopped halfway. Through reaching for the chair across from him. Do you want that seat? He asked. I looked at him for a second, then laughed. You're going to make this very strange if you ask permission for everything. I'm recalibrating. Sit down, Adrian. He did. So did I. It was the first time in 5 years we had been across a table from each other with nothing between us that needed signing, revising, approving, scheduling, or fixing. No badge on my chest. No tablet beside my hand. No clock I was responsible for watching on his behalf. For the first 10 minutes, we were terrible at it. Adrian asked what I wanted to drink, then looked almost offended when I told him he already knew. You said this was supposed to be different, he said. Different doesn't mean amnesia. That got an actual laugh out of him. I realized how rarely I had heard that sound without a closed office door between us. The evening did not become magical after that. It became ordinary, and that was better. We argued about whether a terrible movie he liked was actually good. He asked what I planned to do next, and when I told him I hadn't decided, he didn't offer to solve it. He only asked what I wanted the next job to feel like. No one had ever asked me that before. I thought about it for a while. Like I can go home when I'm done. Adrian's face tightened with regret. I shook my head before he could apologize again. You don't have to make every answer about what you did wrong. I'm trying not to. Try harder. You're enjoying this. A little. When dinner ended, Adrian walked with me to the corner where our routes separated. He didn't ask where I was going after that. He didn't suggest I come back with him. He simply stopped beneath the streetlight and said, "Can I see you again?" It still surprised me how much that question mattered. Not the invitation. The fact that it was a question. Yes, I said. But not tomorrow. He nodded. Okay. I have plans. Okay. I waited for curiosity, disappointment, some old instinct to ask what plans could possibly outrank his request. It never came. Thursday, he asked instead. Thursday works. That became the shape of us for a while. Not a dramatic reunion. Not a promise that 5 difficult years had been erased because we finally understood them. We learned each other again without the office translating everything into obligation. Adrian discovered that I sometimes ignored messages for hours when I was reading. I discovered he could cook exactly 3 meals and considered this evidence of versatility. He asked before making plans that involved me. I stopped saying yes before checking whether I actually wanted to. The first time I told him no because I was tired, he simply said, "Another night." I spent the next 20 minutes staring at my phone because nothing bad happened. No disappointment I had to repair. No silence I had to decode. No cost. It was embarrassing how much peace there was in that. A month after I left, I accepted a position in another department across the city. Different chain of command. Different building. Adrian had nothing to do with it. When I told him, pride crossed his face before anything else. "Do you want advice?" he asked. I smiled. "Not tonight." "Congratulations, then." That was all. And somehow that told me more about his change than any apology ever had. He could be part of my life without managing it. I could accept his attention without turning it into proof of my worth. The resignation remained exactly what it had been, real. I never returned to my old position. The tasks I had carried stayed redistributed. Adrian kept several of the responsibilities he had reclaimed instead of quietly passing them to whoever came next. Some changes were inconvenient. He kept them anyway. Months later, I visited his office after work for the first time since leaving. The room looked mostly the same. Same wide desk. Same crooked brass nameplate he still had not bothered to straighten. Different chair at the side table. Fewer folders stacked where mine used to be. Adrian was finishing a report when I noticed a familiar sheet of paper inside a thin frame on the shelf behind him. I stared. You framed my resignation letter? Adrian looked over his shoulder. You told me to keep it. I did not tell you to turn it into office decor. It's not decor. That makes it worse. He stood and walked over beside me. The letter looked almost ridiculous behind glass. 3 short sentences. My signature. The date that had once felt like the most frightening thing I had ever written. Why is it up there? I asked. Adrian's expression grew quieter. Because I don't want to forget what happens when I confuse someone choosing to stay with someone being obligated to. I looked at him. That's very dramatic. I was a war hero. Apparently, I'm allowed one dramatic object. I laughed. Then I noticed something else. The frame wasn't on his desk. It wasn't where he could stare at it every day as punishment. It was off to the side, visible, but no longer controlling the room. Like the mistake had become something to remember rather than something to live inside. Adrian glanced at the clock. You said you wanted to leave by 6. My eyes moved to the time. 5:54. Months ago, I would have been the one reminding him. I did. He closed the report immediately. Then let's go. No, just 5 more minutes. No request to finish one thing for him first. No assumption that my time would stretch because his mattered more. I picked up my coat. Adrian reached for it, then paused. Do you want? Give me the coat. Right. He handed it over. I put it on myself. Then, because I wanted to, I reached for his hand. He looked down at our fingers for a moment before closing his around mine. That was the part one had never understood when I wrote the letter. I thought freedom meant proving I could walk away. I had needed to prove it. But freedom was also being able to stay without disappearing. Adrian did not need me to run his life anymore. I did not need him to need me. And somehow, without all that usefulness between us, there was finally room to find out what we actually were. We passed the shelf on our way out. My resignation letter stayed behind the glass. It had once been the only thing strong enough to make Adrian see what my presence meant. Now he looked at me while I was standing right beside him. At 6 o'clock, we left together. Not because he asked me to stay. Not because I was needed. Simply because this time, when I chose him, I was completely free to choose something else.